Let Theon your servant be born again from the sea, as you were, Aaron Greyjoy intoned. Bless him with salt. Bless him with stone. Bless him with steel. Nephew, do you still know the words? What is dead may never die, Theon said, remembering. What is dead may never die, his uncle echoed, but rises again, harder and stronger. Hey everyone, Crowfood's daughter here, and if you click this video, you have reached the Disputed Lands. In today's video, we will be hashing out another episode of Ironborn Myth and Legend. This will be the 5th installment within a series dedicated to explaining the origins of Ironborn lore, and will be best understood if you have viewed the previous videos, as we will be building on several established concepts. I have put together a playlist that is linked in the description below, so be sure to check those out. So today, we will be discussing the legend of the Grey King and his Grey transformation. We have touched on this Grey transformation in my video regarding the Grey King and Garth Greenhand. However, with those concepts in mind, we will go further to explore one possibility for the specific mechanics of this Grey transformation. Now let's get started. So, the Grey King. The Grey King was a legendary Ironborn progenitor who was known for his grey appearance. The Iron Islands chapter of the World Book retells that his hair and beard and eyes were as grey as a winter sea, and in addition to this, that his very skin had turned as grey as his hair and beard. In my video discussing fratricidal clues between a Garth-type figure and the Grey King, we unpacked several hints which may suggest a possible rivalry between these two legendary figures. And in the process, we identified several references throughout the series to the age-old trope of brother versus brother, with heavy allegory of the Cain archetype concealed within Ironborn chapters and characters. And it was through these various explorations that connections were found which tie a Garth-type figure to the Hammer of the Waters, with heavy imagery associated with storms, hammers, and horns. In a later video, analyzing the Grey King's mermaid wife, themes in mermaid lore were explored, and in doing so, her role in the Grey King's resurrection was identified. We also delved into several examples of the Nissa Nissa monomyth, which then began to show a pattern of references to the myth of Helen of Troy and the theme of the abducted woman, which suggests the possibility that this mermaid wife may have been desired and fought over by two men. It was also during this analysis of Nissa Nissa that variations of the Azor Ahai legend inevitably began to show themselves, with examples that included Hugh Gore of the Hill, Hugo and the 7 Swan Maids, Argoth Stoneskin, Sir Galadon of Morn, and the tale of the Shrouded Lord, where a woman came out of the fog and kissed a statue to life. And it was through this exploration that a surprisingly strong connection to fools and drowning was recognized, which ultimately led to the discussion of Florian the Fool as another variation of the Grey King and Azor Ahai myth. Now, in my most recent Ironborn Myth and Legend episode, we discussed the theme of the broken sword, and similar to the tale of the Shrouded Lord, where we find a tale of a statue coming to life, we identified another statue, the Titan of Braavos, which legend says also comes to life, and we went further to discuss the imagery and symbolism surrounding this statue. In addition to this, the legend of the Merling King and Merling lore was further explored, with evidence ultimately placing this Merling King as another variant of the Grey King and Azor Ahai legend. Now, aside from the Grey King himself, there is one legend that is of particular interest to me, and that would be the Grey Giant, Argoth Stoneskin. You see, this is quite the description for another version of our Grey King, a grey giant with stone skin. I was particularly interested in exploring the origins for this name in particular, and I must say the most plausible and realistic possibility for this tale could be explained by a man with superior armor, such as iron or steel plate. As we all know, Argoth was said to have won the first melee in Westeros, and the first men did not originally have iron technology, and instead worked bronze for their armor. We are also aware that the Grey King most likely came from the east, and brought the knowledge of certain technologies with him, as it is said that he had taught men to weave nets and sails and carved the first longship. In this instance, there is a very plausible explanation for a gray man who supposedly won a great melee with stone skin, and that explanation would be that he purely had better armor than the other competitors. Sounds simple enough, right? Well, there's one slight problem. When you take Argoth stone skin and you begin to examine the legend of the Shrouded Lord as a statue being kissed to life, and the legend of the Titan of Braavos, another tale of a statue coming to life, well, another possibility begins to emerge, and that possibility would be the literal one, as in, we might have a man with stone skin on our hands. You see, there is some additional information you may not be aware of. If you recall in my video discussing the Grey King's mermaid wife, we had discussed the Andal legend of Hugo that is described in the World Book. Hugo was of course a hero said to have slain the 7 swan maidens, and after close examination, there were some clues that identified this legend as another variation of our Long Night hero. Now, what many readers may not be aware of is that our author had mentioned the Swan Maidens in the past, prior to the publication of the World Book. As it turns out, George R. R. Martin occasionally attends conventions and performs sample chapter readings prior to the publication of his finished works. This, for example, is how the fandom became aware of what is contained in the Forsaken chapter. It was read at a convention. Well, as luck would have it, our author performed a reading of Tyrion 2 prior to the release of A Dance with Dragons in very much the same fashion. And in the original version, the Swan Maidens were mentioned, except in this version, Hugo was missing. Instead, Tyrion hears stories of rock goblins and giants warring. The rock goblins won, but were seduced by swan maidens from the lakes and were made thralls. This was eventually retconned and is missing from the published work. The Swan Maidens later made their debut in the World Book, and in place of a tale of rock goblins being seduced, we instead hear of Hugo. But the evidence of the author's original intent remains. Basically, instead of a famous and storied hero named Hugo, our author had originally used a tale of rock goblins being seduced for this legend. So we have a legend of a man with stone skin, 2 legends of a statue coming to life, a legend where rock goblins were originally used. In addition to all of these, we have the Grey King, a hero whose skin had turned as gray as his hair and beard. Gray skin, stone skin, statues, and rock goblins. Are you starting to see a theme here? Fascinatingly, our author has also written something very peculiar into the storyline, a mysterious condition linked to the figure of the Shrouded Lord himself, which causes the skin to become gray and turn to stone. And that condition would be Greyscale. And now this is where it gets interesting. When I research, I generally look at a barrage of legends and related materials. And when I was first researching mermaids, I noticed a suggested link at the bottom of a page dedicated to mermaid lore. And that link was for something called ichthyosis. It's a skin condition derived from the Greek word for fish, which, similar to grayscale, causes the skin to take on a scale-like appearance. I distinctly remember the term ichthyosis had particularly stood out to me because I had seen it before in the most unlikely of places, the forums of the fandom. As it turns out, there is a very severe form of this condition called Harlequin ichthyosis. This happens to be what several readers hypothesize might have inspired our author for his description of many of the deformities seen in the occasional Targaryen dragon babies. So, out of familiarity and instinct, I decided to explore this further, specifically the Harlequin variety that was already being discussed in the fandom. And sure enough, I soon found what I was looking for, as I found myself staring at a picture of a fool. As it turns out, Harlequin ichthyosis is actually named after a famous fool. The Harlequin was a fool character popularized in the 18th and 19th centuries, and is described as a prototype for the romantic hero. He was a character who had a thing for pursuing his love interest, Columbine, while at the same time competing for her affection against a romantic nemesis who also vied for her affections. Interestingly, the character of Harlequin is thought to be rooted in mythical inspiration. According to scholars, it is thought the name Harlequin could be derived from two leaders of the mythical Wild Hunt. The Wild Hunt is basically a monomythic theme found in a variety of European cultures, which describes a group of hunters or demons who occasionally chase damned souls to hell. What you may not realize is that our writer tends to use little bits of inspiration from several of these mythical Wild Hunt leaders throughout the storyline, as several forms of the Wild Hunt just so happen to be led by many of the figures we have discussed in previous episodes. Figures such as Aaron of Celtic myth, who fought the Battle of the Trees, biblical Cain, who killed his brother, King Arthur, and even a version of Cernunnos called Herne the Hunter. So, in keeping with this theme, I was not surprised to learn that the name Harlequin is theorized to originate from Harlequin, the leader of the French version of the Wild Hunt, and also King Herle, the fabled leader of the Germanic Wild Hunt. So, if these assumptions hold any water regarding the author's use of Harlequin, we are probably going to see some reference to both hunters and Harlequin in relation to the archetype of the Grey King. With these concepts in mind, the World Book actually tells a mighty interesting tale. The tale of Harlon the Hunter and Herndon of the Horn, who were twin brothers, said to have built their castle atop Horn Hill, and took to wife the beautiful woods witch who dwelled there, sharing her favors for 100 years, for the brothers did not age so long as they embraced her whenever the moon was full. So, if you recall, I had previously discussed a possible brotherly rivalry between the Grey King and a Garth-type figure, and in doing so, I had highlighted Garth's association with horns and the Hammer of the Waters through the author's use of House Goodbrother and Storm God folklore. So in this instance, here we have twin brothers. One brother is named Harlan the Hunter, and the other brother is fittingly Herndon of the Horn. In addition to this, I have also touched on the possibility that the Grey King fought over a woman with the power to resurrect, and according to this tale, the two brothers were said to have taken to wife the same woods witch, and this woods witch was supposedly capable of life-sustaining powers. Besides Harlan the Hunter and Herndon of the Horn, we also have two wildlings who deserve mention, Harl the Huntsman and Harl the Handsome, two men who hate each other, and this hate stems from something they both shared, and that would be the affections of the same woman. Two boys looked enough alike to be twins, but Tormund insisted they were cousins, born a year apart. One was sired by Harl the Huntsman, the other by Harl the Handsome, both on the same woman. Fathers hate each other. I was you, I'd send one to Eastwatch and the other to your shadow tower. So Harl the Huntsman and Harl the Handsome are two men fighting over a woman. And according to Tormund, their sons were cousins too, which is an interesting observation because if they were born of the same woman, that would make their sons half-brothers, not cousins. The only way Tormund's statement would be true, the only way two boys born of the same woman could be considered cousins, would be if the fathers of the two boys were brothers, meaning that there is some hidden implication snuck into this passage that Harl the Huntsman and Harl the Handsome are in fact not only two men fighting over the same woman, but also brothers. And don't forget, we also have a character named Harlan of House Hunter. What about him? Well, according to Peter Baelish, he will be killing his brother in due time. I had to know. What will happen in a year? He put down his quill. Redfort and Waynwood are old. One or both of them may die. Gilwood Hunter will be murdered by his brothers, most likely by young Harlan, who arranged Lord Eon's death. In for a penny, in for a stag, I always say. So yes, it does seem as though we are being given references to both Harlequin and Hunters, with characters such as Harlan the Hunter, Harl the Huntsman, and Harlan of House Hunter, in addition to being provided with this brother-hating, kinslaying, woman-stealing archetype we have explored in previous videos. So, with that being said, would you be surprised to see a character named Harlan who has a direct connection to Greyscale? Well, sure enough, Harlan Greyjoy just so happens to be the name of one of Aeron Greyjoy's brothers. And can you guess which one? Harlan he recalled but dimly, sitting gray-faced and still in a windowless tower room, and speaking in whispers that grew fainter every day as the Greyscale turned his tongue and lips to stone. One day we shall feast on fish together, in the drowned god's watery halls, the four of us, and Uri too. Harlan Greyjoy is the name of the brother who had died of Greyscale. Interestingly, there are also several other hints floating throughout the series. Take Patchface, for example. Patchface is a character designed in part as a tool to inform the reader. This is where we get our Little Mermaid references, as well as our drowned and resurrected fool. He serves as a creepy blueprint in a sense. So, because of this, I take a good amount of interest in how this character navigates the storyline, as well as how he is described in various situations. In this next passage, we see the small council conspiring against Stannis, who happens to serve as a strong Azor Ahai analog. Here we see the small council liken Patchface not only to Stannis, but we also see them compare his tattooed, motley appearance to Shireen's Greyscale. And in this same passage, we also see the metaphor of someone with Greyscale being likened to a statue. A trade envoy from Lys once observed to me that Lord Stannis must love his daughter very well, since he'd erected hundreds of statues of her along the walls of Dragonstone. My lord, I had to tell him, those are gargoyles. He chuckled. Sir Axel might serve for Shireen's father, but in my experience, the more bizarre and shocking a tale, the more apt it is to be repeated. Stannis keeps an especially grotesque fool, a lackwit with a tattooed face. Grand Maester Pycelle gaped at him aghast. Surely you do not mean to suggest that Lady Selyse would bring a fool into her bed. You'd have to be a fool to want to bed Selyse Florent, said Littlefinger. Doubtless Patchface reminded her of Stannis, and the best lies contain within them nuggets of truth, enough to give the listener pause. As it happens, this fool is utterly devoted to the girl and follows her everywhere. They even look somewhat alike. Shireen has a mottled, half-frozen face as well. Pycelle was lost, but that is from the Greyscale that near killed her as a babe. So, there is actually some very fascinating wordplay going on here. The small council compares Patchface's motley appearance to Shireen's mottled Greyscale. Motley is a word which basically means a mixture of things and is often used to describe the dress of a fool or a jester, which is often depicted with a checkered pattern or patches, which is where Patchface gets his name. In this scene, we see Greyscale described as mottled, which is an interesting choice of words here, because mottled has a very similar meaning and is synonymous with being blotchy, patchy, variegated, and multicolored. So we see some similarities here. But the thing that we should really home in on is this word's origin. According to Oxford dictionaries, the word mottled emerged around the late 18th century and is believed to be derived from the word motley. So we can see our author not only comparing Greyscale to motley, but we also find him using a choice of words that connect the two as well. Now just remember the comparison between Patchface's motley and Shireen's Greyscale, because we are going to circle around to this concept when we discuss Florian the Fool and his motley armor. In the meantime, in addition to Patchface, if you recall from my video regarding the Great King's mermaid wife, we had discussed the legend of Hugh Gore of the Hill as another variation of the Azor Ahai and Great King legend. One thing that had especially caught my eye with Hugh Gore is how this legend is introduced within the series. In Tyrion 2 of A Dance with Dragons, the very same chapter where our writer had originally intended to introduce the legend of the Swan Maidens, we see that Tyrion is traveling with Illyrio on their way to the Rhoyne, and Illyrio is recounting the death of his wife Sarah, who had died tragically from Greyscale. Oddly enough, this conversation surrounding Greyscale reminds Tyrion of a passage from the Seven-Pointed Star, and the legend of Hugh Gore of the Hill is introduced to the reader for the very first time. Let's take a look. How did she die? Tyrion knew that she was dead. No man spoke so fondly of a woman who had abandoned him. A Braavosi trading galley called at Pentos, on her way back from the Jade Sea. The treasure carried cloves and saffron, jet and jade, scarlet samite, green silk, and the Grey Death. We slew her oarsmen as they came ashore and burned the ship at anchor, but the rats crept down the oars and paddled to the quay on cold stone feet. The plague took 2,000 before it ran its course. Magister Illyrio closed the locket. I keep her hands in my bedchamber, her hands that were so soft. Tyrion thought of Tisha. He glanced out at the fields where once the gods had walked. What sort of gods make rats and plagues and dwarves? Another passage from the Seven-Pointed Star came back to him. The maid brought him forth a girl, as supple as a willow, with eyes like deep blue pools, and Hugh Gore declared that he would have her for his bride. So the mother made her fertile, and the crone foretold that she would bear the king 44 mighty sons. The warrior gave strength to their arms, whilst the smith wrought for each a suit of iron plates. So you can see, the author swiftly goes from a story concerning Greyscale straight to the introduction of the Hugh Gore legend in one quick swoop. Now, remembering back to when we all were first reading A Dance with Dragons, we really didn't fully understand why Illyrio kept Sarah's hands, and probably thought he was just really creepy. It wasn't until we reached the 5th Tyrion chapter of A Dance with Dragons that we learned the deadly form of Greyscale generally starts in the extremities, usually in the hands, and because of this, one or both hands might be amputated in order to prevent the Greyscale from spreading. Later on, we see John Connington has contracted Greyscale, and like we have learned, his infection serves as confirmation of this information, as his Greyscale also starts in his hands. So in a sense, you could say that a stone hand would be a fairly reasonable symbol of Greyscale from what we have learned so far. Additionally, in my video regarding the Grey King and Garth Greenhand, I had discussed how the two legends serve as rival, inverse parallels of each other. Interestingly, the legend of Garth Greenhand retells that this first men progenitor was said to have green hands, causing a green hand to become an obvious symbol for Garth, which can be seen displayed on the sigil of the extinct House Gardener. So, knowing what we have just discussed, let's follow this up and look at a particular sigil for a moment. Our author is a self-proclaimed heraldry enthusiast, and every so often makes use of sigils to hint at the mysteries in the world he has created. The sigil I would draw your attention to is that of House Flint of Flint's Finger. This northern house's sigil is quite peculiar. It actually looks quite a lot like the sigil of House Gardener, which is a green hand displayed in a similar fashion. However, with House Flint, we see it described as a stone hand, the stone hand of House Flint. Now, what you're going to appreciate with this symbol is that it serves as something of a stony parallel to the sigil of Garth, for sure. But the most interesting aspect of the sigil is why our author had given this to House Flint specifically. You see, flint is also a type of stone with special properties because this type of stone is able to make fire, making this sigil an excellent representation of our Grey King and Azor Ahai legend. In addition to these passages, we occasionally get characters being described as stone or being like stone or flint or slate. This, for example, is why Sir Marlon Manderley was described with slate gray eyes and being 3 stones heavier than Davos when he was channeling the Merlin King. For purposes of time, I will not delve too deeply into these instances because there are several. However, many of these occurrences involve Stannis, who serves as an Azor Ahai analog. Lucifer Means Lightbringer actually delves into some of these instances in his episode entitled The Long Night Was His to Rule, which is linked below, so be sure to check that out. In the meantime, however, I do want to show you 2 parallel scenes before moving on. One of these instances is the iconic scene where Rattleshirt is glamoured and is then made a sacrifice to the Red God. Here we see Melisandre proclaiming Stannis as Azor Ahai reborn and the champion of the Lord of Light. If the wall falls, night falls as well, the long night that never ends. It must not happen, will not happen. The Lord of Light has seen his children in their peril and sent a champion to them, Azor Ahai reborn. She swept a hand towards Stannis, and the great ruby at her throat pulsed with light. He is stone, and she is flame. And now this next passage directly echoes the previous, as Beric Dondarrion is quite literally serving as the champion of the Lord of Light in a trial by combat. Like Stannis, Beric also serves as a strong allegory for Azor Ahai. However, our author kicks things up a notch in this scene in particular, when he wields a flaming sword, which subsequently becomes broken in the duel that follows. "Burn in 7 hells," the hound cursed. "You and Thoros too." He threw a glance at the Red Priest. "When I'm done with him, you'll be next, Mir." "Every word you say proclaims your guilt, dog," answered Thoros, while Lem and Greenbeard and Jack Be Lucky shouted threats and curses. Lord Beric himself waited silent, calm as still water, his shield on his left arm, and his sword burning in his right hand. Kill him, Arya thought. Please, you have to kill him. Lit from below, his face was a death mask. His missing eye a red and angry wound. The sword was aflame from point to crossguard, but Dundarian seemed not to feel the heat. He stood so still, he might have been carved of stone. So what we get here is a passage that parallels the previous, providing imagery of a man serving as a champion of the Lord of Light, who is carved from stone and wields a flaming sword. By this point, you're probably asking yourself, why Greyscale? How could this be relevant for our Long Night hero? And this is a good question, and one that I've asked myself. And when it comes down to it, the only way this would be relevant for a Azor Ahai or a Long Night hero would be if Greyscale was somehow beneficial, or if it inadvertently provided an advantage. It could be that Greyscale prevents those infected from being turned into whites. Or maybe there is something about Greyscale that offers another form of protection. There are a couple possibilities here. In fact, this very concept of protection could be what is hinted at in the Forsaken chapter, where we have a character giving off strong Bloodstone Emperor vibes, and this character also happens to be covered in scales. Euron Crowseye stood upon the deck of silence, clad in a suit of black scale armor, like nothing Aeron had ever seen before. Dark as smoke it was, but Euron wore it as easily as if it was the thinnest silk. The scales were edged in red gold, and gleamed and shimmered when they moved. Patterns could be seen within the metal, whorls and glyphs, and arcane symbols folded into the steel. Valyrian steel, the Damphair knew. His armor is Valyrian steel. So, as you can see, with Euron, we get a character who is something of an analog to the Bloodstone Emperor, another variant of the Azor Ahai legend. And we also see that our author has now given him an entire suit of scales, made from one of the strongest materials ever to be forged. And now, things are about to get interesting again. If you recall, from my video on broken swords, you will understand that a broken sword is a very outward symbol of our Long Night hero. This concept of the broken sword is the very reason we have the legend of the Perfect Knight, Sir Galladon of Morn, a hero whom the maiden herself lost her heart to. You see, in Arthurian legend, there was also a hero named Sir Galahad, who was renowned for his gallantry and purity and was described as the most perfect of all knights, or sometimes simply, the perfect knight. It just so happens that it was Sir Galahad who mended the broken sword of David in his quest to seek out the Holy Grail. In a sense, Sir Galladon of Morn is simply just another call-out to the broken sword hero, which is a recurring theme throughout the A Song of Ice and Fire series. So, knowing what we have just discussed regarding Greyscale and protection, would you be surprised to learn that Nordic myth contains a very different kind of broken sword hero? A hero who just so happened to grow scales all over his body, said to repel any blade or weapon. As legend tells it, Sigurd was a hero of the Viking line of Volsung kings, who is referred to as Siegfried in the Germanic variation of this tale. It is said that Siegfried inherited an incredibly powerful sword from his father, who had died in battle before he was born. However, there was one slight problem. The sword was broken by Odin directly before his father was cut down. So, in reality, he had inherited an incredibly powerful broken sword. As Siegfried grew older, he decided he needed to prove his courage, and had resolved to slay an infamous and really hard-to-kill dragon named Fafnir. But in order to kill this dragon, a hero must have a hero's blade. and so Siegfried enlists the help of a smith in order to forge a sword capable of slaying this powerful beast. Now, remember the tale of the 3 forgings of Lightbringer. According to legend, Siegfried's sword also required 3 forgings. In this tale, the smith confidently forges Siegfried a splendid sword, but the sword is easily broken when Siegfried attempts to use it. On a second attempt, the smith makes a sword even finer than the first, but again, this one also breaks. On his third attempt, Siegfried's mother provides him with the 2 halves of his father's sword, and the pieces are brought to the smith to be reforged anew. And when Siegfried struck an anvil with his father's newly reforged sword, the anvil is cloven in 2. And so Siegfried sets out with his special sword, and he does indeed slay the dragon. But in doing so, he inadvertently bathes in the blood of the dragon, which causes thick scale to grow all over his body, making his skin invulnerable and able to repel any blade, except in one small spot. Unfortunately, in the end, Siegfried's friend named Hagen betrays him over the love of a woman, and Siegfried is mortally wounded. So, just as we have a Bloodstone Emperor analog walking around the Forsaken chapter, covered in scale armor that is virtually invulnerable, Siegfried is a broken sword hero with his own invulnerable scale armor, who, like Azor Ahai, engaged in 3 forgings in order to obtain his special sword. And it just so happens there are only 2 characters within the A Song of Ice and Fire series named Siegfried, and they both happen to be Ironborn: Siegfried Stonetree and Siegfried Harlaw. But wait, in addition to Siegfried, we also have one character in the series named Hagen. You know, the name of the guy who betrayed Siegfried? Well, Hagen also happens to be an Ironborn character. An Ironborn character best known for his warhorn. So, lots of really fascinating connections here. But the most interesting aspect of this hero is actually his relation to the real world figures who are theorized to have inspired his legend. You see, it is theorized the legend of Siegfried was inspired by several early kings of the Merovingian dynasty, a line of nobility who were afflicted by a scaly skin condition due to another form of ichthyosis, called ichthyosis hystrix. So, in addition to what I have already mentioned, the legend of Siegfried also contains connections to the very same condition that had originally spurred on this line of inquiry. In addition to this, the legend of Florian the Fool may also be instructive. If you recall earlier, we discussed Patchface and how the small council had compared Patchface's motley to Shireen's mottled Greyscale. We went further to discuss the choice of words our author used and how the 2 descriptions both share a strong interrelation to each other. So, when we come to the legend of Florian the Fool, he is said to have worn a very peculiar type of armor. In the Hedge Knight, we see a puppet show taking place where the story of Florian and Jonquil is reenacted. It is during this play we learn Florian's armor is described as being a motley armor. And in A Dance with Dragons, Tyrion also confirms this description when he sarcastically tells Jorah to put on a suit of iron motley. Due to the way we are provided with a comparison between Greyscale and motley, in addition to our author's choice of words, I believe the possibility exists that Florian's motley armor was not really motley, but was likely later interpreted as such by the singers and storytellers. So instead of a man with Greyscale, we instead get a knight wearing motley armor, which again may be instructive as to the purpose of Greyscale being protective. With all that being said, we really need to look at another roaring giant. As mentioned previously, the Grey Giant, Argoth Stoneskin, is likely another version of the Azor Ahai legend, who was said to have spent his days raging outside of Old Town, roaring for his bride. Our broken sword-wielding Titan of Braavos is similarly a legend used to inform us about the character of our Long Night hero, and he too happens to be a roaring giant, as he roars to herald both the rising and the setting of the sun. In addition to these, the Rhoynar have their own version of a Long Night hero, the Old Man of the River, who is said to have brought back the dawn by setting aside his differences with Mother Rhoyne's other children to sing a secret song. Now, with the Old Man of the River, we sort of get a sighting of this Rhoynar god in the Tyrian chapter directly prior to arriving in the Sorrows. It was another turtle, a horned turtle of enormous size, its dark green shell mottled with brown and overgrown with water moss and crusty black river mollusks. It raised its head and bellowed, a deep-throated, thrumming roar. According to Isilla and Yandri, they had believed they had seen a manifestation of their deity as a huge turtle the size of the Shy Maid with a mottled shell rose from the water as the sun was rising, and this gargantuan turtle promptly raised its head and bellowed a deep-throated, thrumming roar. So just as the Titan is a giant who roars to herald the rising and the setting of the sun, the Old Man of the River is also a giant with a mottled shell, who we see roar at dawn to herald the rising of the sun. In truth, the A Song of Ice and Fire series is incredibly steeped in imagery and symbolism. Many of you are probably also aware that George R.R. Martin uses a turtle as his own personal sigil, and is rarely seen without a turtle fastened somewhere on his hat or clothing. In several interviews, he has retold countless times the significance turtles had in his childhood, which were the basis for his earliest stories. Now, with that being said, with our author's love of both symbolism and turtles, wouldn't it make sense that his choice of a turtle for a Long Night hero might also hold a greater meaningful significance? Well, when you really think about it, this animal has a very special defining feature, and that would be its shell. Basically, a turtle is very much what would be considered armored. So, if the Old Man of the River, a huge turtle, is the Rhoynar version of their Long Night hero, then what might be hinted at symbolically is a hero who is also armored and inherently protected. So, how does Greyscale offer protection? It's a difficult question. It's a hard, stone-like covering for sure, but that didn't stop the crew of the Shy Maid from making quick work of them when they became inundated. Maybe it offers protection from being turned into a wight, or it's possible Greyscale offers protection against the swords of the others. It's pretty hard to tell with certainty, but there is one possibility I feel deserves mention. As I have discussed in the past, the Grey King most likely underwent a fiery transformation, a fiery resurrection. In the Reaver chapter of A Feast for Crows, Victarion Greyjoy sustains a deep gash to his arm, and by the time A Dance with Dragons rolls around, this arm has now festered and has become a serious and potentially life-threatening complication. However, as luck would have it, a red priest comes aboard after miraculously surviving a terrible storm, and Victarion's arm is soon healed through fire magic. And once healed, something very strange happens. His arm becomes improved. As Victarion puts it, the arm was stronger than it had ever been. "The Silver Queen is gone," the Ketch's master told him. "She flew away upon her dragon, beyond the Dothraki Sea. Where is this Dothraki Sea? He demanded. I will sail the Iron Fleet across it and find the queen wherever she may be. The fisherman laughed aloud. That would be a sight worth seeing. The Dothraki Sea is made of grass, fool. He should not have said that. Victarion took him around the throat with his burned hand and lifted him bodily into the air. Slamming him back against the mast, he squeezed till the youngish man's face turned as black as the fingers digging into his flesh. The man kicked and writhed for a while, trying fruitlessly to pry loose the captain's grip. No man calls Victarion Greyjoy a fool and lives to boast of it. When he opened his hand, the man's limp body flopped to the deck. Yes, fire magic resulted in that when Victarion's arm was healed. So, if fire magic can do that, it's possible what we are being provided here with is the prospect that fire magic also has transformative properties in addition to the resurrective ones. So, knowing what we have just discussed today, let's take a look at the customary Ironborn blessing once more. Let Theon your servant be born again from the sea, as you were, Aaron Greyjoy intoned. Bless him with salt. Bless him with stone. Bless him with steel. Nephew, do you still know the words? What is dead may never die, Theon said, remembering. What is dead may never die, his uncle echoed, but rises again, harder and stronger. That's right. He rises again, harder and stronger. Well, that about wraps things up for today. I have a couple of announcements to make regarding this channel. I have been very resistant in the past to creating a Patreon, but in the end, I caved. So, for those asking about a Patreon account for the Disputed Lands, I do now have one, and if you're interested in supporting this channel, there is a link in the description box below. In the meantime, my next video will be a collaboration with Joe Magician, and we will be covering some interesting things related to the extinct House Strong. So be on the lookout for that.
If you like this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, hit the subscribe button, and leave a comment below. Thanks for watching!